Oh, wow. That was a much better welcome than I got last time. Thank you. We're going to be best friends by the end of this session today. I didn't do this last time. I just jumped right in. But I worked for People for Care and Learning for a lot of years. Some of you may have heard about them. We did the Build a City project in Cambodia, and some really cool stuff there that I may talk about later. So I work for United Way of the Ocoee region. I have 2 jobs there. 50% of my time I'm a mentor in residence. So if you want to start a nonprofit, or if you're in town and you're running a nonprofit and you need advice or help, you would probably end up being paired with me, and I would help you walk through fundraising ideas or board development or whatever you need for your nonprofit. So if any of you are dreaming up a nonprofit, I'd love to hang out sometime, meet with you. And then the other part of my job is I work with Dustin, Tommy, who came. That was this class, right? With Impact Cleveland? Yes? Okay. So Impact Cleveland got a $4 million grant from TVA to do energy retrofits on homes. The poorest neighborhood per capita, the poorest, most low-income census tract block in Bradley County is where we work. It's called the Blythe Oldfield neighborhood. It's about 477 residential units there. It's the 3rd most low-income census tract block in East Tennessee, and top 10 in the whole state of Tennessee, right here in our own backyard. So one of the biggest problems that was diagnosed were that utility bills were outrageous. So these would be homes that are about 800 square feet, so very small homes, and they would be having utility bills in the wintertime, $300, $400, $500 a month because of holes in the roof and holes in the floor and poor insulation and window units that aren't energy efficient. So we applied for this grant and got it. So we can, for 300 homes, we'll be able to go in and do a complete energy retrofit. So new HVAC unit, new windows, doors, insulation. And so far we've been seeing at least 50% reduction of monthly utility bills, some as much as 75% reduction on a few cases. So this is basically these families $200 or $300 more a month that they're able to use in their family instead of having to use it on energy bills, or worst case scenario, going without heat or air at all. So it's a neat project, and those are the things that I do. I teach here, and I teach at a school in Chattanooga, and I'm on staff at the Mission. It's a great church in Chattanooga. So I do a few different things, but that is enough about me. Let's get to the topic at hand today. I turned 41 on September 7th. It's my birthday. And historically, birthdays didn't bother me. I've never been the type to dread a birthday or to regret a birthday. But for some reason, last year, on my 40th birthday, the months leading up to it and a couple months after, it really bothered me. And I didn't know exactly why. And I've been processing over this last year why this bothered me so much. But a lot of it has to do with our topic today, simplicity. I literally laughed out loud when Dr. Stevenson emailed and asked what could have been seen as really random for me to talk about simplicity, but it is the thing that God's been dealing with me about over the last 3 or 4 years of my life, but really significantly over the last year since I turned 40. So just a couple of things. So a lot of my life has changed since I turned 40, and I think it's the deep psychological anxieties of that birthday. I don't know why, but just for fun, right? 2 of the things. One thing is that for whatever reason now, I will cry on you in a second. So don't give me a compliment today, and don't let me compliment you, or I will cry, and it's embarrassing. Now, I've always been prone to tears. I've been a little bit of an emotional dude forever, and I have an example here. This is my wedding picture 19 years ago, and some things to notice. The first one is that I was crying profusely. This is a absolute true story. The pastor had to stop and during the wedding ceremony in the microphone and asked me if I was okay because I was crying so hard. I mean, shoulder shake, ah! It was ridiculous. I don't know. I was born, I came out of the womb wanting to be married. I don't know why, but it was just a significant moment for me. Second thing to notice, my wife, she's beautiful. Third thing to notice, she didn't shed one tear the entire ceremony. She completely showed me up. And I know that this is not exactly target audience material here, but what really frustrates me is that she never cries. She's I used to call her hard-hearted Hannah, even though her name's not Hannah. That's really weird, but never cries. And then all of a sudden, this series called Parenthood. Has anybody watched Parenthood? Well, okay, a couple of people. she like sits in front of the TV and watches Netflix and bawls her eyes out over parenthood. I'm like, you couldn't cry at our wedding? And you can cry at this fake TV show? And then this is how bad it was. A few weeks ago, I was meeting with a female student from Lee. We were having coffee, junior. Never met her before in my life, ever. So to her, I'm a complete stranger. And she was telling me about, she was wanting advice for some nonprofit stuff and telling me about things that she had accomplished already in her young life. I'm so impressed with you guys and girls. Like, your thought process is so far beyond what mine was when I was your age. It's impressive. And I was just impressed with her. And I tried to tell her, like, I'm really legitimately proud of you. And as I was saying this to a stranger, a tear like came down my cheek. And I tried to blame allergies, but I know that she thought, I need to get out of here. This dude is crazy. And the second thing is I'm really addicted to naps. Like, all right, cool. I love naps as a student, like loved them, but now it's like a calendar item. I'm like, okay, when's my nap going to happen today? I have one scheduled in about 30 minutes, so we'll definitely let you out on time. That's a joke. So I logically realized that 40 isn't old, and I'm going to take this picture off because that's embarrassing. I used to have that on our mantle, and friends would come in and just die laughing. So it's in a box now. So I logically realized that 40 isn't that old, but something happened the week of my birthday last year that was an interesting experience. I was meeting with a friend of mine who is 10 years younger, and he saw on Facebook that I had an upcoming birthday, and he said, "Hey Jake, how old will you be turning?" And I said, "I'm going to be turning 40. And his face was like, like Jimmy Fallon, like it was gross or something. And this was his direct quote: "Whoa, man, that's crazy. Now that your life is halfway over, is there anything you regret?" He really meant it, and I know that sounds terrible, but he meant it like, I don't want to make any mistakes. He was asking for advice, but it just was worded so poorly, in my opinion. But a really fascinating thing happened, and he didn't realize it. But I really think the Holy Spirit used that question to convict me of things that had already been happening over the last several years. But it was like in my mind, it probably was only a 10-second, but it was in my mind, I had this reel of things that were just flashing through my mind, of things that I wasn't stewarding well. And really, to use the word that we're using today, it's things that I needed to simplify and let go of in my own heart. So when Dr. Stevenson asked me to talk, I literally laughed. And I just want to share some personal stuff and hopefully leave time to just talk about a couple of New Testament passages. So just about me, maybe somebody can identify with this. I grew up in a church, a small Pentecostal church in the South in the Bible Belt. It was a great church. There were great things about it. Today I'm not going to talk about the great things. I'm going to pick on that church a little bit. But just know that it was a great experience, and I'm not negative toward them. But for me, it was a little bit of a detrimental upbringing for my faith for a few reasons. One, my church didn't allow any critical thinking. So I've always been a skeptic and a cynic, and I don't like those things about me, but it's just kind of built into who I am. So if you tell some dramatic story, my first response is, that's not true, right? You're just making that up. I've always been that way. And then with truths of the Bible that I was taught, even from a young age in my mind, I would have a hard time believing those things. So I claimed to be a Christian, and I said the prayer, and I prayed and I worshiped, but I had these deep, deep doubts and struggles. And every time I would ask somebody in my home church about it, their response would be something like, that's the devil, that's the enemy, don't even think about those things. Don't even entertain those thoughts, just press in toward God. And that turned out to be almost detrimental to my faith. The second thing about my church is it teetered on the line of prosperity gospel church. So if you're a part of a prosperity gospel movement, I don't want to offend anybody, but for me personally, that ended up being something that really bothered me. So in the mindset of the church is that I grew up in is if you were a really good person and you tithed, then God would give you a bunch of money and a bunch of wealth. And if you didn't have wealth or money, then you were doing something wrong. And then the third thing is I was the baby of 3 siblings, and my family was we weren't wealthy, we were upper middle class. and I got everything I ever wanted. Both my brother and sister were already out of college, so I was basically an only child. And man, I was entitled and selfish and never had to work a day in my life. And you combine all these things together, and I love Jordans, like shoes. And every time the new Jordans came out, my dad would get them for me, no questions asked. And so everything I ever wanted is like given to me. So those things all kind of collide. I come to Lee, did the pastoral ministries undergrad. Moved around a little bit, did a master's degree in biblical studies. And during my master's degree, I was exposed, unfortunately, kind of later in life, 27, 30, something like that, to critical thinking and these doubts that I had crushed down in my spirit that I wasn't allowed to talk about came raging back. And I had really significant faith struggle. But I was a pastor on staff at First Baptist at the time. And when you're a pastor, you can't tell somebody that you're doubting Jesus. Just to be completely honest, like my college students that I'm leading wouldn't love if I showed up in the platform and said, I don't know if Jesus is really the only way to the Father or not. I'm really struggling with that. You can't have that kind of vulnerability in a church setting where you're leading people. But that's the kind of deep struggle I was having in my life. I do believe that Jesus is the only way to the Father. I've gotten back to that. Anyway, we'll get there. So if that wasn't bad enough, I started having the opportunity to travel internationally and do missions work. And I had this experience, and I want to show you a couple of pictures that changed me significantly. And this was in 2010, and this was the moment where, for me, a journey toward simplicity started. I wouldn't have used those terms at the time, but over this last year, I've really grown to grasp that this is what God's calling me to. So I hope that you can start your journey younger. If you haven't read the assigned reading that Dr. Stevenson gave you, please read it. It's going to offend you. It's going to make you think this is too radical, this is too extreme. But please read it. Please process it. Please open your heart to it. Let God convict you maybe of some things. But in 2010, some friends of mine, I have an adopted child from Ethiopia and one from India also, and a biological son. We have 3 boys. But after I adopted our son from Ethiopia, I fell in love with Ethiopia and Ethiopian culture. And I got on the board of directors for an organization that worked in Ethiopia. And we were there in 2010 with a small group of people, and this is the city trash dump in Addis Ababa, the capital city. It's closed now, but at the time it was the largest city dump in Ethiopia and one of the largest dumps in Africa. It was a very controversial place. The government did not want Westerners, especially white-skinned Westerners, to see this place. So it was guarded, and tourists and foreigners weren't allowed in. And for whatever reason, I have to think it was divine providence. This particular day, us and our group of people, we were invited in to the dump. And so this is a group of guys hanging out on top of one of the trash mountains. So to kind of paint the picture, these families, probably 200 or 300 individuals, several dozen families lived in this dump. Like this is where their home was. And as you know, for landfills, they reshape all the time because they're bringing in new trash and they're leveling it with bulldozers. So the flat ground changes almost daily. And they would live in tents, and they would just move their tents every day or every other day to the flat spot of the trash dump. And in trash dumps and landfills, if you don't cover them correctly, they have spontaneous fires that combust and start. So during cold nights, they would just go and search out these fires, and that's how they warm themselves around it. And we were here, and I know this story sounds like, again, I'm a skeptic. If you told me this story, I would doubt you. But I'm like promising this is what happened. We went in, and about 60 or so, 50, 60 of the people kind of gathered around us. And through an interpreter, we were just broken hearted. And I said, it seems like such a terrible question. Is there anything we can do to help? Like, what do you need us to do while we're here? We're here for a couple hours. We'll do anything that you need. And the guy's response, I promise you, was this: we're never touched. Would your team mind to shake our hands, embrace us, and pray for us? Like, we're just stunned. We expected not that request. So we take a few minutes, not a few minutes, we took about an hour, and it was just awesome. It's one of the coolest experiences I've ever had of us hugging them, and they're broken and in tears and love what's happening. We are humbled and loving it. And during the course of the time there, I knew a girl was like messing with my arm, but I was praying for this guy and I wasn't really paying attention. She was about a 9-year-old Ethiopian girl that lived there. And So I didn't know what was happening. So we finished there, we were walking back to the van, and somebody was like, hey, Jake, what's on your arm? And I looked down. She had found a magic marker somewhere. She had one, and this is what she had written on my arm, that God is love. And if you've ever had those moments in life that you'll never forget and where instantly something happened in your spirit, for me and our whole team, this was one of those moments. We stood there in awe of this girl, that her perspective, the thing that she thought to write. I don't even know how she knew English. We didn't know that nobody spoke English to us. But that what she wrote on my arm was God is love in her situation. So like silence, that was we left there at about right at lunchtime. We skipped lunch. We went back to our room. We canceled everything for the rest of the day, and literally none of us could talk. So it was basically silence till dinner time, and then I felt like as a leader we needed to debrief. And our conversation was one of the best conversations I've ever experienced of American Christians abroad. I've taken tons of teams. But we started thinking through, these people would, when a trash truck came in, they're huge there, and it would dump its trash, dozens of people would rush to be there to find the best of the trash. Bananas that were whole, meals that were boxed up, something that could be recycled. And it was this frantic rush to this truck, and there were constantly people getting backed over and killed and buried alive with these trash trucks coming in and out. It was terrible. But we started thinking back to our meals that we had eaten there. And we went to nice restaurants, and a lot of us wouldn't eat most of our meals. And what we didn't realize at the time is that was being poured out, our scraps, and people were fighting and dying over our excess. And as you process this, it's you don't know, what do you do about that? And that was just the beginning. At that time, that was the worst poverty I'd ever seen. And then, I'm just going to take that picture down. But that was the worst poverty I'd ever seen at that time. And then a few years later, 2 years later, I went to Cambodia for the first time. And I can't even, we did this project called Build a City. And the people were living in this village. There was no running water. There were no toilets. There was no electricity. There were very insufficient homes. So people would use the restroom in the streets, or they would use it in plastic bags and throw the plastic bags out in the streets. And the way the land was there, about half of the city was kind of up on this little slope, and the other half was down in a valley, and there wasn't a way for water to escape. So during the rainy season, it would come and it would wash all this feces and urine and everything else down, and it would stop right here on the lower part of the village, so a couple hundred families. And every once in a while, every couple of years, the city would come and drain this. But when I was there, it was toward the end of a 2-year stagnant cycle, mosquito infested. And it was so bad at this point that people had to move their beds up. So they sleep on wooden platforms, and they had to build their platforms up because when they would sleep, manure would be floating underneath their bed. And at the point when I got there, the adults would step down into about thigh-deep manure, urine, leftovers, trash, to walk to work. And they had this Cambodian word that I can't pronounce, and the literal translation was water eats leg disease. So their flesh on their legs was literally falling off. And I stood there, and combined with all my other issues, I'm shaking my fist at God and saying, God, why do I warned you. Don't say I didn't warn you. Why do I have so much and they have so little? And I would come home to the American church, and I went through this season of really frustration with the American church, right? I blamed everybody else. I would look and I would sit and I would see these lights and these smoke machines and this production and these awesome worship leaders and people just consuming dollars, right, to make this production happen in church services. And then I would fly over the next month. I was going 4 or 5 times a year. I'd fly over the next month to Cambodia, and I would sit underneath Pastor Ike's house. And underneath his house, people would walk for 2 or 3 miles. And during church service, most of them have cell phones, which is interesting. All around the globe, people are using cell phones. But they didn't have a way to charge them. So Pastor Ike would open his car hood, and they had this contraption, and they would charge their cell phones on his battery while they were in. That was their weekly cell phone charge. And they would sit in this church service and worship their guts out. And I never will forget one lady, we asked for prayer, and she came up, and she had cancer. She had just been diagnosed with cancer. And we prayed for her, and through an interpreter, she said something like, I would give anything if I was American and I could have somebody cure me, but we don't have any curers here. So if God doesn't answer your prayer, I have no hope. And again, I'm like hit in the face with our excess, our comfort compared to their lack. And I'm like devastated. What do I do with this? And then what happened to me over the next couple of years leading up to this is a few things. The first thing is I started realizing that I couldn't blame the American church because I was just as bad. I was obsessed with wanting other people to think that I was really cool and that my car was nice and I lived in the right part of town and I had all the things that Americans need to have. And I was just as bad as that church, spending all that money on production. And I knew that I had to change my heart. I had to lead my family better. I had to simplify. I had to get rid of stuff, not just things, but like mindsets. And I had to change. And then my dissertation chair, I was doing my PhD at the time, and I was like processing this with him. And he started making assignments he assigned me to read like St. Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, St. Benedict, the monastic movement, the Desert Fathers, and these people who gave all for Christ, right? They lived in community in such a way that they everything was about Jesus. And that started this like painful self-examination process for me. Because somehow I had grown up in church and I had never realized the New Testament and Old Testament obsession with the poor. All the way to the point where you would give everything you have for others, whether it was your life or your resources or your time or whatever. I had missed this, and I had grown so comfortable, and I was just in agony. And my role models started changing, and I started admiring and really respecting stories like Mother Teresa, who hopefully she's not too far gone. Y'all know who Mother Teresa is, right? If you don't, you've got to go today and start researching. Mother Teresa was a well-to-do girl from Albania, and she moved to Calcutta, long story short, but she did amazing things in Calcutta, India, one of the worst parts of the world at the time. And then her ministry grew global. Hundreds and thousands of people knew the love of Christ through her ministry. She would so she had this mission that nobody would die without dignity or love. So she would literally sit with people who were dying with leprosy and all her volunteers. So that the last thing you knew before you died was the love of Christ. One mom had a troubled teenager and somehow got this teenager connected with Mother Teresa and went to Calcutta. I say teenager, I believe she was 19 or 20. And just severe problems and issues and didn't love God anymore, decided she was going to give up on her faith and attitude problems. She goes for 2 weeks and Mother Teresa gives her this task of rocking babies who were going to die until they died. So for 2 weeks, all she did was hold infants and rock them until they died because infant mortality rate was so high. And then they would give her another baby the next day and she would rock that baby until that baby died. That's giving all, right? Saint Francis. Now this dude is weird. Like when I get older, I want to be so weird that you don't know if I'm a genius or if I'm crazy. I think I'm well on my way. But Saint Francis was that way, just crazy guy. But he would do things like They baked bread in these big ovens in the middle of the community. So these huge ovens, they would come out and the community would bake. And they'd be really hot during the day, but at night they would cool off. And homeless people would go and sleep inside these ovens to stay warm. And St. Francis would voluntarily go out and sleep in the ovens with people. He would, if his bed got too comfortable, he would move to a more uncomfortable spot because he never wanted to be comfortable in this world. He would oftentimes, and this is really crazy, he would oftentimes come home completely naked because he had given all of his clothing away to people who had less. And when he started getting sick, and the people who were living with him made him promise that he wouldn't come home naked anymore because he was getting sick from being so cold and unsheltered. I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was in Germany, the Hitler regime, Nazi regime, and he was definitely going to be killed because they hated him, because he was speaking for Christ. And he got a job at Union Theological Seminary in New York, comes to America, has everything he's ever dreamed of. And he's here about 24 hours, and he's looking out at the water, and God says to him, "You've got to go back," knowing certainly that he would be arrested and probably spend the rest of his life in a concentration camp. And he goes back and gives all. But because of his writings and because of his influence, one of the things that ended up bringing down that regime. Like, these are the kinds of role models I aspire to. I am so far from them. I want to share with you, I'm going to leave some time for questions, so I want to take some time and share with you a couple of passages. In the New Testament, the Roman culture can be described as an honor-obsessed, power-hungry, promotion-consumed society. So when I say honor-obsessed, the New Testament was written in a culture that was honor-shame. So financial wealth didn't necessarily even matter. It was if you could achieve more honor. And the way you did that was by surrounding yourself with people who were honorable and distancing yourself from people who were shameful. So the pursuit of honor would guide every decision. Your business partners, your friendship networks, even who was allowed to eat at your table. The Roman Empire thrived on power and honor, force, and promotion. Power-hungry, promotion consumed. Everything was about this idea of a course of honor. So it was a course of offices that would be followed by someone in pursuit of an elite political career. It wasn't only available to the elite, but to individuals. It was duplicated in rural areas, clubs, local municipalities, among the non-elites. For instance, this was one from a village. This was a series of offices, and I don't have time to unpack all that they mean. But basically, you would start at the bottom, right, and you would surround yourself with people who are more honorable, and then you might be able to take the next step up the course, quote unquote, what scholars call the course of honor, and then the next, and then the next. And this was your lifelong pursuit. So you would not spend time with people who were shameful. You would not spend time with people who had less than you, less power, less voice, less influence. It would have been detrimental to your career. And then into this culture, Paul writes in Philippians. He's actually, most of this verse is quoting a hymn that pre-existed Paul, so one of the earliest New Testament writings we have. Fascinatingly, probably one of the earliest forms of Christian leadership teaching that we have. Most people think that they would sing this hymn, and it was a way to remember to lead differently than culture said to lead. But it says this, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place." And here's what you have Paul doing. He makes a statement that to us, we just read right past. But if you were listening in that culture, that obsessed with power, right? You obsessed with power and promotion. When Paul says that Jesus was made of the same stuff as God, whether you're a pagan or whether you were Christian or whatever you were, you immediately understood that that was an enviable position, right? To have that amount of power, to be equal to God, was an enviable position. You couldn't get any more powerful than that. And that would have been something, as a listener, you would have said, whoa, that's like, you're so jealous. You want that. And what Paul says is that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, something to be held tightly to, something to be used to his own advantage. So again, you're listening in the original audience, you're starting to get confused. Like that's the reason you get power, is to use it to your own advantage, to get more power, to get more things, to like keep climbing the ladder. But Paul throws a wrench in this, and for Christian leaders, he starts to speak into them and says, I want you to lead in an entirely different way. Right? So he didn't use it to his own advantage. And if that's not bad enough, the next thing that Paul says is he uses this Greek word kenosis, which is he emptied himself. So it's like if I had a full glass of water and I voluntarily poured it out. That's the mental image, is that Jesus was full of all the things, stuff, power, honor, whatever you want to call it. He didn't use it to his own advantage. Instead, he like poured it out. He emptied himself of this power. And he took a step down. Instead of a course of honor, you have Paul taking Jesus down a course of shame. So if that wasn't enough, it says that he took on the form of a slave. So it's almost like you can imagine Jesus was in heaven, right? Angels, creation, forever. He's been with the Father. And he has the power. He's equal to the Father. He's got everything that anybody's ever wanted. And he says, it's time for me to empty myself of this power and to have less stuff, things, power, voice, influence, worship, whatever. So that wasn't enough. So Jesus took the form of a slave, which wasn't a good thing in that culture. So that wasn't even low enough. He needed to like leverage, give away more stuff, things, power, honor. So a vulnerable infant, right? The most vulnerable thing you could be. He became nothing. He humbled himself to death. And it's like Paul, you can see vividly what Paul is doing, especially when you get to the end and Paul adds this, even death on a cross. So even death as a criminal, even death as a reject, an outcast. And what the takeaway from this is this to me. When you find yourself with any measure of power or influence, leverage it for those who have less power or influence. When you have any measure, so all of you in here today, whether you want to admit it or not, you have some measure of power, influence, or voice, or resources. I want to encourage you to consistently figure out how you can leverage that for somebody who has less of those things. One more illustration, or scripture. These are really nasty feet. These are the feet of Mother Teresa. And this is a great story. Some of you may have heard of the author Shane Claiborne. Shane went and did a year internship in Calcutta with Mother Teresa. And he noticed one day she was praying and he was looking at her feet, and one of the sisters, one of the nuns, she was watching Shane watch Mother Teresa's feet. And she said, "Do you know why her feet are so deformed?" He said, "No." She proceeded to explain that they get boxes of donations of shoes. And she says, "We all know that we can't touch those boxes. Mother has to be the first one to go through them. And she will meticulously go through and pick the worst pair for herself. And then after that, we can give away the shoes to other people." So after years of wearing these shoes, or no shoes at all, her feet have become more deformed. Luke 14, 7-9 says this. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited you both will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. But what would happen, it's my favorite New Testament passage, by the way. What would happen is if all of you were invited to a wedding, and it was my son getting married, right? And I invited all of you to the wedding of my son, who's the groom. That's cool that you're invited, but I would have this after party, or I'd have a symposium, and it would be after the wedding, and it would be in a very public place, so when everybody was leaving, you would be able to see who was sitting with me, because table fellowship in the New Testament was huge. Who sat at your meal table said all kinds of things about you, and you wouldn't want anybody at your meal table who was shameful, right? Who would bring shame to you. So I would coordinate this, and out of all of you, I may invite a select few of you, I don't know exactly how many, 15, 20, to join me in the after party. And if you were invited, that was a great thing. But what was even better is if you had a place of honor at that table. So I would have a chief guest, and hopefully the chief guest would be like the most honorable person, way more honor than me, so that when all of you walk past, you'd be so impressed that just because I say he because women wouldn't have been allowed to participate in this, unfortunately, but he would have so much honor. You would walk past on your way out, and you would say in your mind, wow, Jake must be the man, right? Jake's got him as the chief guest. He's got a lot of honor. So I would have the chance to increase my honor. And then what I would do is I would strategically place people in descending order of honor, from my perspective, away from me at the table. So if you had a seat at the very end, in my mind, you had less honor than the person that had the seats of honor, which would have been right next to the host and the chief guest. Does that make sense? I don't know if you can see that, but the red seats down here, the seats of least importance is what Jesus calls them. And the ones at the top would be the most important places. And Jesus is sitting at this wedding, and he's watching this happen, and he's watching people like rush out to these tables and sit at the most important, like they're fighting over the most important seats. And Jesus gives this really practical example. He says, what's going to happen maybe is that the host is going to go out, and I'm going to see you sitting in the most important place, but that's not your assigned seat. So maybe in front of everybody, I'm going to say, hey, you need to move down to the least important place. And in front of everybody, you'll be humbled, right? Or I might walk in and see somebody at the least important place and say, hey, what are you doing down there? You need to move up here. And in front of everybody, you'd be exalted. So Jesus speaks into this and makes this powerful statement that would have been so counter to everything within their culture. Right? It would have been revolution. Doesn't seem revolutionary right here today in this warm, nice, cozy lecture hall where it's hard to stay awake. But if you were listening in that day, and Jesus turns to his disciples or his friends or his followers, and he says, don't do that. When you go out there, you rush, you sprint, and you be confident in the least important place. Don't get your honor from people. Like your value, your validation comes from God. So let other people have that honor. Simplify, get rid of, shed yourself of the wanting to please people, and be confident in the least important places in society. That's a powerful statement. But what Jesus says is maybe, not maybe, but surely, God, as the host, his eyes are looking through the earth, and he's wanting to find people who take these least important seats and say to them in front of everybody, why are you there? You need to be promoted. But it's on his terms, and it's in his ways. When I was hanging out with my friend on my 40th birthday, there were so many things that ran through my mind. It really was a weird thing, and I've honestly been processing this over the last year. But some things that I've processed. The first one is how greedy me and my family had become. This is embarrassing to admit, but we had become so much in debt that it was very difficult for even to pay our tithes. So forget like supporting people who needed financial support or helping missionaries or any of those kinds of things. I mean, we were so strapped because we wanted the seat of honor. I really wanted people to think that I had my stuff together and I had the cool things, and our greed suffocated our generosity. And we're working really hard to correct this. And I told the last class, like, this is very counter to humility to tell this story, but as an example, and really, I'm still struggling with this. But I had a really nice F-150 Super Crew truck. Loved my truck, right? Could fit our whole family in there. But the problem is that, one, we had a car payment on it, and two, I work in the Impact Cleveland neighborhood, and I've fallen in love with our residents. And most of our residents make less than $14,000 a year, right? None of them could ever dream of affording a Super Crew F-150 pickup truck. So just the thing I drove up to their house, I love to go sit on porches and hang out and talk. I'd roll up to their house, and immediately I started noticing there was this disconnect that I couldn't understand them because of the vehicle I drove. And it was just stuff. It was just stuff. So for a year, I've been struggling with this, that I need to get rid of this thing. And I didn't want to do it. But last week, I'm proud to admit, I finally sold my truck. And I hate it and I love it all at the same time. And I got me a little $4,000 car. But now when I roll up to my friend's house in our neighborhood, I feel like I get out and there's just a little bit more street cred, right? There's a little bit more identifying. We don't have that car payment anymore. We've simplified that. So now we do have a little bit of freedom in our budget that we can help people who need help from time to time. We're working hard to eliminate our credit card debt. My wife has an awesome car. We've got it for sale on Craigslist right now. All of these in pursuit of simplicity. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying, right? I'm not saying that you can't have nice things, but our nice things had control of our lives. So on that day about regrets, my mind immediately went that I had to make some changes. At that time, I was working for People for Care and Learning. I was traveling overseas too much. I was away from my family. I was missing my boys' birthdays. I was missing anniversaries. And I knew when he asked me that question, again, it was a weird experience. It was like the Holy Spirit just, I don't know if y'all believe in these kind of things or not. The Holy Spirit just like spoke to me. It was like machine gun. I knew I needed to quit that job. I knew I needed to leave that job. I wasn't stewarding my family well. I was being selfish with that. I loved traveling. I loved the quote-unquote glamour of it. We were a popular organization. But I knew, so I made a very difficult and uncomfortable job change. I knew immediately that I wasn't stewarding my calling well. And this is really personal, and I hesitate to even share it out loud in case I don't follow through with it. But I was called to be a pastor when I was 16 years old. And I have ran from that call. I've done all the other jobs in the church. My call at 16 was a vivid call to be a senior pastor of a local congregation. And for whatever reason, that scares me beyond anything that ever scared. I don't know why. But I consistently have rejected that idea, and I've taken other jobs. So I'm sitting here at 40 knowing that God's called me to something that I've been avoiding. And a lot of it was because of stuff, right? Because I wanted to make more money than that, and I wanted a cooler position than that. I didn't want to simply be a pastor. I'm not a pastor yet. So if y'all see me when I'm 70 and I'm not pastoring, you can be like, Jake, get on it. The most pressing realization I had on that day was that I wanted to make a difference with the time I had left. So let's say maybe he was right. Maybe my life was halfway over last year. I don't know. Maybe I'll live to be 120. But if that was the case, man, I can't keep avoiding these things that God's doing in my spirit. Right? I need to lean into these concepts that I'm fascinated by, vows of poverty and vows of generosity and vows of obedience. And if I'm going to be in this Christian thing, I want to be all in. Like, I want to find the people in our community that have been forgotten, and I want them to know the love of Christ. I don't want to anymore want the city council members to know my name and to be on these silly boards. Like, I really, truly want Kim Marshall, who lives at 1395 Chippewa Avenue, to know that Jake Stum loves her in her poverty. And I know that sounds preachery and that's cliche, but like, I've got to lean into that. And I've got to shed myself of things holding me back from that. And a lot of it has to do with just gaining honor, this obsession to gain honor and favor in your eyes or in the community's eyes. But that's not what Christ has called me to. So if I'm brave enough, I want to lean into this, and I want to maybe call some of you to lean into this with me. Don't get obsessed with stuff. Don't get obsessed with what other people think of you. Be comfortable and confident in the places of least importance in the world and see what God can do. Amen? All right, I went too long. We have like 3 minutes. So I'll take maybe a half a question. Does anybody have any questions?
they come from poverty? I know you
Yeah.
said one was from,
One from India, one from Ethiopia.
but was it the poor parts or did you go?
Yeah, they were both from poverty-stricken areas. Yeah.
So, like you go overseas, you see all this poverty, and it's like you're faced with this overwhelming question, like, what do I do with this? And it seems almost wrong to like do nothing, you know. So what do you do with it? What have you?
First of all, I knew that we needed to get rid of our debt so that I could help financially more. We're the richest people on the planet, and I know that's hard for you college students to believe. But we are. That's one thing that I know that we are doing. We have to do more. The second thing that I knew is that I had to start serving locally instead of globally. Which I'm all for international organizations, but for me, I knew that the Spirit was kind of calling me to all these efforts and energy I was spending internationally. I needed to shift my attention to Cleveland. So for me, these days, it's a really practical thing where, again, and I hope I don't want this to come. I hope this comes across correctly, but like sitting on the porches of the people in the neighborhood that I serve, and having conversations and knowing their needs, and figuring out ways to help them in ways that won't hurt them. That's my expression these days of what to do about it. But I think the wrong thing to do is to see these overwhelming issues and do nothing. Like if it's as simple as a child sponsorship, which I'm a huge, even after traveling international, I'm a huge fan of child sponsorships through the right organizations. Like leveraging your $30 excess a month for a child to be sponsored is a simple step to do something. I would encourage you to do more than social media activism. Frustrates me to no end. Like, it's cool you want to post about it, but please take that the next step. And maybe your first step towards simplicity is just sacrificing something small, like coffee. I'm addicted to coffee. If I didn't go to Bond Life, I'd probably save like $50 a month, and that's no exaggeration. I think there's tons of little ways, and then you can just grow in that. God's probably calling some of you to start international organizations that are going to significantly make a dent in poverty. Lean into that, yeah.
You could be already, if you go back, what would you do differently so that you would be in a better place now?
Man, that's a great question. There's so many things. But I wish that I had community. And I know that's a buzzword, and probably you guys hear, but I avoided community. I didn't insert myself into a community where I could process these things I was doubting. Where people would challenge me to live better. I just surrounded myself with people who were like me, and we just had fun. Like we didn't take our faith seriously when I was in college. So I would have really sought out some sort of environment that pushed me, that challenged me, people that spoke truth into my life. I would have learned about the other side of the tracks. Lee does a much better job now than they used to. When I was here, I went through all of Lee, and I never realized that the community I'm serving in now was even there. I would make it a point to get to know people who are struggling in our county, and Lee makes opportunities available for you, so it's not like you have to go out on your own. There's all kinds of ways that you can get involved. That I could go on and on. I think those are a few. Yeah.
Are you seeing change and improvement with your organization going into the community?
Oh man, it's so awesome. Yeah, we aren't a Christian organization, but we have seen spiritual change in really cool ways. But what we do is we go and we work alongside leaders, so residents who live there. So we've helped them form their own neighborhood association. And now the neighborhood association's grown to like 30 people, and they're petitioning city council to get stop signs and street lights and sidewalks, and like they're doing the work. And that's amazing. We started a neighborhood watch program. It's the only nationally certified neighborhood watch program in Bradley County. And crime rates have like went boo in our neighborhood just because of the neighborhood watch. Yeah, I know we're past time. Thank you guys so much.